I've mentioned world models a few times lately, and I thought I'd dive deeper into what I mean when I say that. World models were introduced to me a few years ago through this paper that I want to share. This was published in 2018, and this is an interactive paper, and it's, in my opinion, probably the best academic paper that I've ever seen. The idea is just presented so clearly. This is available at worldmodels.github.io if you want to play with it yourself. And I'm not associated with this at all. I just think it's really interesting. So the idea of a world model is that when we do any activity or observe anything about the world, we actually have a really simplified representation of that. The example here is riding a bicycle. You're not thinking about every element of the chain and the tire pressure and every rock on the path when you're riding a bike. You have a much simpler model of how to lean, how to turn, how to provide power to the wheels through the pedals, and that's all you need to operate the machine. That's the idea with world models as well, is how do you generate a simplified model of the world that represents everything you need to know to be able to act in the world. And in this paper, they use 3 different models to do that. They have a vision model, which I think is the most interesting part of this paper. I'll talk about that a lot, but then they also incorporate a memory element and a controller, which are also important, but maybe less novel than the vision element is here. So this model is a variational autoencoder. And all that means is that the model is trained to generate an output that exactly matches the input. So in this case, they're putting in an image, in this case from a video game, but it could really be anything. And then they run it through a model which squeezes it down. So every layer of the model is a little bit smaller than the layer behind it. So the input layer is the entire image with all the pixels, all the colors, everything. And the next layer is a little bit smaller, and it has to represent all that data as a little bit smaller, and a little bit smaller, and a little bit smaller, until you get down here to this Z vector, which is a final embedding or an encoding of the image. And in this case, you can see, I'll talk more about this, but they represent it here with about a dozen parameters. So this is really small compared to the 100,000 or so pixels that are coming in the beginning. And then the decoder does the opposite. It expands it, expands it, expands it to try and recreate that input data, even though it had to be squeezed through this really small pipe of only a dozen or so parameters in this case. But these models can be really good at it. So here are some examples of a screenshot from the video game that they're using and the reconstruction. So you can see some of the details go away, some of the structure in the brick is missing. But importantly, all the enemies in this little video game are present. The location of the wall is correct. So all the things that you might need to play this game are represented, which again is what we were looking for with a world model. We don't want to think about every mechanical piece of the bicycle. We just want to think about how to ride the bike. And the interesting thing with this interactive paper is you can change these parameters and see how it changes the reconstruction. So you can see this top one maybe has something to do with the location of that wall. Some of these others will change things. You can see enemies sort of fading in and out back there with that one. Here's some like bullets coming at us. So that's important for a model that's learning how to play the video game. This one is a more subtle change, but it could be in other scenes that's more important. That's just kind of the nature of how these go. And we can load some random of these Z vectors, these intermediate ones. And you see different scenes that it can possibly represent. We can also load different screenshots from the game and see the Z vector that matches this and the output that that reproduces. And you can see these are all pretty accurate, which means that the world model is pretty accurate. And it's at least possible, at least in theory, that you could program an agent or a robot or something that could control itself in the world based on these. The critical thing, though, is that there's so much less data here. This Z vector is only a few bytes compared to just a lot more data coming in on the images. And that lets you do the next interesting thing that they're doing with their control model is keep a history. So you're not just looking at the latest frame, you're looking at many frames over time and then feed that into the controller. Here's their little diagram. So their controller is here. The VAE, the autoencoder, is here. So you take an input, sort of squish it down, and when you're running the controller, you don't bother expanding it out again. You just need that intermediate representation. That comes out, it feeds into your memory, and it also feeds directly into the controller. So the controller sees the full data of the last, like the most recent input. And then it also sees the output of this history block, which is sort of a distilled history over some amount of time in the past that you've designed it for. And so this just sort of circularly updates as it gets new observations. You get the latest observation, those get into your controller, and they provide the action that you want to do. In the video game environment, that might mean a controller input. For a robotic controller, this could be more advanced than that, but that's the idea. That's the feedback loop that's here. So I want to share the other example that they've included in this paper is like a race car on a racetrack, sort of a video game. And same thing here, we can click through different screenshots. You can see the road that it's on, the little car, and that's represented pretty well with the z-vector. But one thing that you can do, and seems like it might be related to the way that humans learn things and incorporate memories and all of that, is they talk about this in terms of dreams. That maybe one of the things we're doing while we're dreaming is you have all these wild ideas of things that might happen to you in the future or things that happened to you in the past or different variations of those, and you kind of let your brain imagine what you could have done differently, what you would do differently next time, and that's an important part of learning. And so what they're proposing here is that this is sort of the equivalent of dreaming for the controller that you're programming. So you can give essentially random frames, like random inputs, vary them over time, and then let the robot imagine what it would do to that. So you can see this robot's trying to follow this road. It sort of gets variations here. What does it do when it turns? What does it do on a straight road? What if it's slightly off the road? All these things. So here's sort of a fresh start, but one thing I think is really interesting is they have this slider that they call the temperature. And you can crank this up, and it goes from relatively normal, relatively straight roads to, if you crank this way up, it's sort of just in nightmare mode. Like the road is dropping out. You see really tight curvature that you've never seen. You see like all these crazy things, disconnected roads and T's and things like this. So it's really kind of a nightmare mode, which is interesting as far as pushing a robot to its limits and finding out what it does in extreme circumstances. Now I'm going to turn this back down for this poor guy so he can get back on the road and do what he's used to doing. But they have this for both for this race car agent and the same thing for the like Doom style shooter game. I just think it's really interesting, the idea of world models. I think it's a really useful tool for designing and testing robotics. So I'm looking for solutions that can do that. This paper is several years old. A lot of the ideas that are presented here have been built upon over the last few years. There's some really cool tools, a few of which I've pointed out in recent videos, and some I haven't had a chance to go over yet. But I'm looking into these. I'm looking at these for robotics development. Anyway, but I just wanted to share this. It's a few years old, but I think it's a really cool paper. It's presented really well. It's really fun to play with this. Go check it out if you can. It even loads on modern phones pretty well, so you can check it out and play with it and get a better sense for what world models are, what that means, and how it could be applied to advanced control systems in really big, complex environments, which is what we're going to need for the future. So anyway, hope you enjoyed. That's it for what I have to say about world models right now. I'll catch you next time.